This is the panel on digital trade in a fractured world. And as you all know from previous times here at the Aspen Forum, that this international panel is always the best and most exciting of any panel at the conference. The issue of digital trade, as you all know, is extraordinarily important. It accounts, digital trade, the last numbers that I saw, which I think were 2020 numbers, digital trade is about 25% now of all trade. Gives you an idea of the scale and scope. The political aspects of it are arguably even greater today. And I think that's one of the major areas that we'll be discussing. Steve, Ambassador Lang, can you start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, David, and thank you for upping the pressure by calling this the best panel of the event. Yeah, I'm Steve Lang. I'm with the U.S. State Department. Last month, I left a position as the U.S. Coordinator for International Communication and Information Policy. And I'm still with the State Department, but transitioning out, so I am speaking in my own capacity today. And I'm wrapping up a 30-year career with the State Department. And over the last 10 years or so, I've focused primarily on international tech policy issues. But for the previous 10 years of my career, I worked mostly on U.S. relations with China. And so that's really kind of the lens that I bring to this question. And I think this topic is very important and very timely. And for me, I think it's interesting to focus on what we mean by a fractured world. And for me, I think that means concerns like fragmentation of the internet, different approaches to governance of technology and regulation of digital trade and in the digital space. And we often hear about three different approaches to digital governance that are leading to fragmentation. We have an authoritarian approach championed by China. We have a relatively laissez-faire approach in the United States and a more regulatory approach in the EU. And so for me, I think because I believe that the United States strategic competition with China is really the defining foreign policy challenge of this century. I think it's important for us to look at ways that we can find commonality with the EU and other like-minded partners as we face that challenge with China. And I think we have a lot more in common in our approaches to technology with the EU and other partners than we have differences, especially within the context of the challenge that China presents. And I think that challenge from China is so critical because its approach to technology is very different and could have a profound impact on society. Our tech competition with China is not only important to our national security and to our economic prosperity, but also to how we live our lives and to our democracy. You have the contrast of China, where technology is used to control speech, to suppress dissent, and measure loyalty in a way that I think is totally contradictory to our democratic values. So that's the context that I look at this from, and within that context, I guess I think, as I said, it's important for the United States and Europe, where I think the key division lies, for us to look for the commonalities in our approaches to technology and to focus on those. Because I do think we need to present a united front as we look toward how we govern technology internationally. And in that context, I guess I have a few recommendations, a couple for the United States and a couple for Europe. One for both of them overall is that we need to focus on the commonalities and look for ways that we can work together. But for the United States, I think it's important, especially in the context of digital trade, to realize and not to undervalue the importance of trade and services as we are looking, as this administration is looking at our trade relationships around the world and rebalancing them, to keep in mind that the trade and services and digital trade is also critical to our economic prosperity, and we shouldn't only focus on trade and goods, and to also keep in mind the incredible innovation that comes from our digital trade. So that's a first recommendation for the United States. A second is I think that we could do a better job in promoting and advocating for our approach to digital regulation in contrast to the European approach, and what we see as the Brussels effect, where regulation is replicated, copy and pasted in some markets around the world. And I think the United States can be more effective in advancing our approach and explaining how we take on these issues. And in that context, I think something, as an earlier panel focused on today, something like federal privacy legislation could be very useful in clarifying our message and what our approach really means. And then I have a couple of thoughts for the European Union and recommendations there. I think in recent years we've seen a reconsideration on the approach to regulation there, and a more focus on the need to take a less heavy-handed approach to regulation through things like the Draghi report. And I think that's a good thing, and I think needs to be encouraged because, I mean, frankly, the regulatory environment there that seems to be intended to create opportunities for European champions isn't really working. We don't see those European champions appearing. And I know that DSA and DMA have only been really enforced and on the books for a little while, but I don't think that they are going to create the kind of environment that's going to produce tech giants in Europe. And then my other thought for Europe is that, from my perspective, digital markets and these industries are maybe more competitive than it might appear on the surface. And U.S. tech giants that are clearly targeted through regulations like the DSA and DMA with different requirements for firms based on their size and their reach, I think is misguided, because we do see, I think there's more competitiveness and more dynamism in these industries than maybe appears on the surface. And I think with the introduction of AI and its impact on areas like search, and we see competitors like TikTok rising in the space of social media, I believe that there's a lot of competition out there and a lot of potential changes in these markets, and that we don't, and that there's some of the focus on competition in Europe may be misplaced. And we do see that the impact of this heavy-handed regulation in things like products not being introduced in European markets that really have a detrimental effect to encouraging the kind of innovation that I think they're trying to achieve in Europe.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just drill down a little bit on a couple of things that you said. On the one hand, you said we in Europe should work more closely together to combat the pernicious aspects of China in the area of digital writ large. While at the same time, you also note how complicated our relationship with Europe on these various issues are. We've been talking now for a couple of administrations about trying to do just what you were talking about. But it's not clear to me that we're making very much progress with regard to China. Give me a little reason to be optimistic.
Well, I think it's going to be a process. We're going to have to continue to work on the irritants in our relationship and try to find ways to make sure that our markets stay interoperable and that our companies can compete and thrive in each other's markets. But we also at the same time need to constantly work to make sure that we're identifying the commonalities and the challenges that China faces, and the spaces where the threat from China's approach to technology is greatest and is gaining ground, and look for new mechanisms for cooperation that allow us to work together to face that threat.
One last question before going on to Alan. The president, there's a lot of discussions about perhaps a summit between President Trump and President Xi later this year. It may or may not happen. But clearly there's a lot of discussion about trying to figure out a trade relationship with China. Tariffs are out there, a variety of other issues. Do you think digital trade issues will be part of those discussions?
I absolutely think that digital and tech issues will be part of those discussions. I guess it depends on how narrowly you define digital trade itself. I don't know that there will be something like a conversation on e-commerce, but I'm certain that things like export controls on chips or network security will be part of that conversation.
Very good. Yeah. Alan?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I want to start off by saying that I agree with what Steve has said, really about the focus on the commonalities with Europe and shared values and the criticality of digital trade to our collective economic prosperity and that of the United States. And with so much, staying on your theme, David, of the optimism spectrum, with so much to be pessimistic about in the world, actually one of the things that I'm optimistic about is the digital trade issues with the EU, maybe less so with China. And this is true despite some of the rhetoric that we're hearing from the very top over here. I actually think we may be on digital issues, digital trade issues, moving somewhat closer toward convergence between the United States and the EU. One of the things that we are not talking about these days, not talking about at this conference until I mention it, is international data transfers between Europe and the United States, which has been so contentious for so long, with various agreements, safe harbor, for various agreements that allow data to be transferred from Europe under its privacy regulations, now the General Data Protection Regulation, to the United States without a finding that the U.S. privacy system is adequate, that is to say, substantially equivalent to that of the EU. This has been a long-standing bone of contention. Numerous decisions by the European Court of Justice have struck down efforts to compromise. And I should mention that at the predecessor version of this conference, back in around 2000, Ira Magaziner was here speaking at this conference. I remember taking the shuttle back to the airport with him. He was representing the Clinton administration, which negotiated the safe harbor for these data transfers, and talking about convergence with the EU to allow these transfers. So this conference has been a part of these issues for a long time. This is not now something, the international data transfer problem, that is really acute, and it has been for so long, threatening the ability of U.S. companies to move data about their employees, their customers, and so on from Europe because of the Court of Justice decision. So there's an Austrian, he was a long-time law student, maybe he eventually got his degree, Max Schrems. He was the protagonist, the plaintiff in two cases that the Court of Justice and the EU struck down this effort at a compromise between the U.S. and Europe. He has not filed a Schrems III complaint, maybe because he's moved on to other things, maybe because a member of the European Parliament, a gentleman by the name of Latombe, has filed it. So it is pending before the Court of Justice whether, again, the European Union's Commission finding that the U.S. privacy system is adequate, that is to say substantially equivalent to that of the EU, can finally sustain review by the Court of Justice. And by the way, the entire issue that has blocked international data transfers through the 2015 decision, the Court of Justice, the 2020 decision, and the entire contention is not about the U.S. commercial privacy, but rather about the surveillance issues that we were addressing earlier in Chain's panel, because there are concerns by the Court of Justice after the Snowden leaks that the U.S. intelligence community is surveilling the emails and the social media posts of European citizens. It has a bit of an unreal quality to it. So why am I optimistic about it? For the data privacy framework, which is the successor to the Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield, President Biden issued an executive order about signals intelligence and providing certain limitations on U.S. signals intelligence collection, really quite remarkable, and accepting the European concepts of necessity and proportionality in terms of collection of data by the government. So President Biden issued this executive order, 14086, enhancing safeguards for U.S. signals intelligence, and establishing a redress mechanism for European persons who believe that they have been unduly surveilled. How they would know that is another question. But there's a redress mechanism that, in fact, the U.S. established something called the Data Protection Review Court with very dignified and illustrious jurists and lawyers on that panel to investigate when there's a complaint whether the surveillance was excessive. This is really quite remarkable. Given, and as we mentioned in the prior panel, as was mentioned, President Trump has issued, I think the number was over 140 executive orders. Most of those rescinding Biden's executive orders. He has left in place this signals intelligence executive order. I think that's very significant. Just as he left in place President Obama's PPD, Presidential Policy Directive 28, which was issued for the same effect to try to essentially assuage or ameliorate the tension on the international data transfers. So I think we may be good to go on that. One kind of point to note is there's a certain reciprocity that has been established, and this was under the Biden framework, where it was established that the United States Department of Justice was going to examine the privacy safeguards of the European member states towards U.S. data. And the Department of Justice conducted this equally intensive review of the European practices as the European Commission has done of the United States. And the Department of Justice found the European standards and safeguards to be okay, almost comparable to those in the United States when looked at holistically, which would clearly in context what that meant. When we're grading on a soft curve, the European privacy commitments are almost as good as those, almost comparable to those of the United States. That reciprocity element in terms of both sides looking at each other's practices, I think is going to be useful in achieving convergence. I should also note another area that we're achieving convergence, I think, or approaching convergence with the EU, is in terms of restricting exports of data of American citizens. And again, it goes to our shared values with Western democracies and concerns and hostilities towards China. So in April of this year, the Department of Justice under President Trump finalized rules that had started under President Biden that restrict the export of sensitive U.S. personal information to China and other adversary countries of concern. This is the first meaningful restriction on exports of U.S. personal data, sort of, tracking what the EU approach is. There was also established, I think Steve would know much more about this than I, but the Trade and Technology Council between the U.S. and the EU, looking for convergence on approaches to emerging technologies, again, based on common interests. In the last few days, there have been some press reports saying that this is still a sticking point because of all of the various digital regulations that the EU is imposing. The Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the AI Act, the plethora of these rules. So this is still a sticking point between the United States in the Trump administration, and it's holding up a finalization of as I understand it, the trade agreement that was announced back in Scotland at the end of last month. So this is continuing to be an issue. Some of that rhetoric from the top that I was talking about earlier, President Trump issued a memo on defending American companies and innovators from overseas extortion and unfair fines and penalties. So President Trump has said that if other countries, let's say like Europe, are discriminating against US technology companies, let's say under the Digital Markets Act or Digital Service Act, they're going to pay the price. Just to wrap up these issues, it was interesting in the earlier panel that Mr. Ekholm of Ericsson said that he acknowledged the underperformance of Europe in the last 20 years, and there's very strong consciousness in Europe that all of their approaches to technology and innovation have really held back Europe. Steve mentioned the Draghi report, as was also mentioned. This was the Mario Draghi, former Prime Minister of Italy, head of the Bank of European Bank, really impressive person, issued a report saying that Europe, one of the reasons for the lack of growth and falling so far behind the United States is overregulation, and that there are what he called gold plating, and the report cites how many regulators there are looking at the same issues in the EU, and that something has to be done about it. So convergence, they are trying to do something about it in the EU, streamlining their regulations. J.D. Vance went over to Paris in February and really called them to account for over-regulating, especially against U.S. technology companies. That's really actually taken hold over there. The EU did drop their AI liability directive as a step in the direction of trying to moderate their regulatory approach, although they rejected efforts to delay the effective date of the EU's AI Act. So they are going forward with that. But a sign that really progress has been made in persuading the EU to moderate their regulation is that the brilliant law professor Anu Bradford of Columbia Law School, who coined the term Brussels effect, is really pushing back hard on what seems now like the EU's moderating the regulatory. Just in the New York Times yesterday, at least it was online yesterday, maybe in paper, she's saying, Trump wants to let AI run wild. This might stop him. And this is the EU regulations. So she's trying to tell the EU, in an article in the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, she said the EU should not give up its superpower, and its superpower is regulation. And so she is trying to push back against what seems to be, again, a convergence on more moderated regulations and recognition that the EU, Europe, has shared values with the United States as against the non-democratic countries like China.
Oh, terrific. A lot to unpack there, but let me just go to one quick thing before we go to Andrew, which is you talked about the ongoing litigation for the European Court of Justice on the current relationship on the digital transfer of information, sometimes referred to as Schrems III, even though, of course, as you point out, he's no longer involved. Give me some odds. What do you think the odds are that the court will uphold the relationship? And if so, what does that mean as a practical matter?
Yeah, I think they will. I would bet on they will uphold the data privacy framework. That is to say, rule in favor of this compromise on allowing. It isn't Schrems III, as it'll be Latome, but they will act in favor of the decision of the EU Commission to allow the sharing of data with the U.S. I think that the EU Commission strove mightily to satisfy the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice gave some specific suggestions on how the Commission had to proceed in order to prevail the next time, and I think they have done that. The practical effect, I think, will be significant if it is upheld, because one, it'll take this real sore subject, bone of contention, off the table. I will note that there are two significant developments where U.S. technology companies have been doing business with EU institutions. One was Cisco with its telepresence, and the European Data Protection Supervisor had done an investigation of whether the use by an EU institution of this American cloud and technology product was consistent with European privacy laws. The European Data Protection Supervisor concluded, I think, rather prudently, that the EU institution in question was authorized to do it. The EU institution in question was the Court of Justice of the European Union using Cisco's product. The EDPS, European Data Protection Supervisor, also blocked, filed a case against the Commission itself, which is a customer of Microsoft's M365 cloud product. The Commission and Microsoft appealed this adverse decision by the EDPS. I have been involved in that case. I can't talk about the details. It is pending before the General Court of the Court of Justice, but I think this Cisco decision for the Court of Justice is a good precedent. And one last thought is the U.S. playing a greater role in establishing international rules for digital trade. There's a great article by Shane Tews in the Wall Street Journal last week that we can't just abdicate the Brussels effect to let the EU set the rules for the world. This is going to be quite relevant on AI, where the U.S. action plan on AI, the new Trump administration plan issued in April, really makes one of its main pillars U.S. leadership in global fora, not just in technology, but also on controls and rules. So I think we're going to play a bigger role, the United States will, than we did on privacy, and I think that'll be a good thing.
Yeah, and you point out the Vice President has shown a lot of interest in this in a fairly unusual fashion. Andrew?
Thanks, David, and thanks to everyone. It's been a really interesting last day and a half. I think I have to start with the notion that Europe's superpower is regulation, because it raises a really fundamentally important question for all of us, which is, what do you want your regulations to accomplish? And that question's always been important. I think it's probably even more important today, given where we are in the economy and the extent to which technology and AI are going to continue to transform the global economy. So, for better and worse, because many of our businesses operate globally, we really have a front row view on the ways in which regulation impacts global trade. And it's clear today that Europe's ex-ante approach to regulation is a failed experiment that other countries should not repeat. That will only become more apparent as the evidence continues to mount and as AI ushers in another period of transformative change across the global economy. There are at least 5 fundamental defects that these ex-ante regimes share. 1, they target quote-unquote digital companies as though they exist in a separate universe. As we all know, and as this conversation in the last day and a half has illustrated, the entire economy runs on digital technology. And again, that's true today. AI will make it even more true tomorrow. 2, they specifically target US companies based on artificial user and revenue thresholds rather than specific harms. 3, they regulate fundamentally different business models in fundamentally different markets, from search to social to mobile operating systems and app stores to retail, with the same broad brush set of rules and intervention framework. 4, they impose or threaten heavyweight compliance regimes without requiring proof that these regimes produce corresponding customer benefits. And 5, they compound these errors with the risk of massive fines for noncompliance. So in short, these laws abandon the fundamental principle that regulation should address specific harms based on evidence, proof of harm, and a careful balancing of risks and consumer and economic benefits. As Professor Carlton said well yesterday, policy that has so many objectives you don't know how to weigh them ends up being ineffective. So for any country that wants to be a leader in innovation, the mounting evidence that the DMA is causing is damning. European businesses are losing access or experiencing severely delayed access to cutting-edge AI technology, including Meta's Llama 4 large multimodal models, Apple Intelligence, and Google's AI Overview. European businesses are losing millions in sales based on constraints on personalized advertising. And those limitations favor incumbents while causing particular harm to the smaller businesses that depend on that kind of advertising to reach new customers. And consumers suffer in multiple ways, including degraded search and the fragmentation of services designed to interoperate. So as the Draghi report that everyone has been talking about here calls out, these and other laws have created an existential challenge for Europe. The EU economy is stagnant, and the EU is struggling to create a true innovation economy. EU businesses estimate that 40% of their tech resources are spent on compliance with regulation, and that figure goes up to 45% for startups. Imagine, almost half of your tech spend. For us, the precious resources at the heart of innovation, instead being spent on compliance with regulations. Studies predict nearly $98 billion in annual additional compliance costs, lost revenue, and fines from these regulations, with those fines targeted, obviously, particularly at large US companies. And over 45% of late-stage funding for European startups comes from foreign sources. So you have regulations driving away the investment that the EU badly needs and choking the growth of its most promising scale-ups. And overall, delays in AI adoption are going to put EU businesses further behind their US and Chinese competitors. So the DMCCA is newer, and the evidence is less clear, but you already see the UK executive backpedaling fast to try to prevent like harm in the UK. The most notable examples of that are the recent replacement of the chair of the CMA, the regulator charged with enforcing the DMCCA, and the government's quote-unquote strategic steer to the CME, which demands a pro-growth agenda focused on innovation and investment. So we have a natural experiment playing out before our eyes. And the question is not whether these regulations work. The data proves they don't. But whether countries will learn from Europe's failed experiment or repeat its mistakes. Thanks.
No, that's terrific. And let me drill a little bit further on that. Obviously, one of the commonalities of all three presentations is the failure of regulation in Europe and the impact it has on US interests, but also obviously European interests as well. Andrew, I've been hearing now for years European leaders talk about this issue and recognize the impact it's had on European economy. And yet, with a few minor exceptions, there's been really no significant movement to reform. You have a front row seat on this. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that over the next couple of years, we'll see real reform?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and I think I have to be for my job. I think there is very serious concern in Europe that their approach to regulation is at the heart of the stagnation of the economy and some of the other concerns that have been identified throughout the last day and a half. Draghi report accelerated that, and I do believe more broadly, as you look across countries around the world, that there is an increasing appreciation that these kinds of regimes can stunt growth at a time when innovation is paramount. And I believe that will increasingly be true even in the next handful of years and going forward. So I think there is a clear understanding of a need to make changes to the approach in Europe. I think also Europe's a little bit stuck. And stuck in part because this approach has been celebrated in the ways that it has. Europe, for years was on a regulatory roadshow with other countries, proclaiming the virtues of these regimes. The evidence doesn't support that, but I think they're caught a little bit betwixt and between, trying to have a regulatory approach that fosters innovation and investment, and overcoming the heavyweight layers of regulation that they have imposed over the last number of years in particular.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question, but for all three panelists who would like to answer it. I think, as I mentioned before, and as you just illustrated, there's an increasing recognition of the costs of this regulation being substantially outweighing any potential benefits associated with it. Is the problem primarily coming from Brussels, from a bureaucratic position, or is it coming equally from the member states? And related to that, one of the things which you really haven't touched on is that digital trade issues are important for large companies, and there's a lot of focus on that. But the statistics also say it's even more important for small and medium-sized companies. Europe is full of small and medium-sized companies, as is the United States. What is the impact associated with that? Andrew, maybe I'll just start with you and then work our way down.
Yeah, I think it's a critical call out. Again, I think the answer is complicated. Europe's complicated in part because of where it is historically. I think the idea of a single union is incredibly powerful, and that's still a work in progress. So there is a lot of complexity as between European regulation and member state regulation. That's very challenging for all European countries. We know that firsthand because we hear it from our customers. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to simplify and to harmonize, and that will produce significant benefits for Europe. Whether the push for the ex-ante approach came from states or the union, that's a complex question also, maybe unsurprisingly. I think that the evidence of the harm that those kinds of laws has caused is increasingly clear at the member state level as well as at the union level and the commission level. But the trying to, again, with the sort of fragmented approach, I think that Europe has to work through, there's going to continue to be pressure on both sides that will make it hard to achieve both a streamlining within Europe and an approach to regulation that I think is more strongly supportive of innovation and helps us all to make sure that concerns about the ways that innovation is changing the economy are addressed.
Alan?
Well, on the question, David, of whether the problem is coming from Brussels or the member states, I agree this is a complicated question and a very intractable problem. I mentioned Professor Anu Bradford, who coined the term the Brussels effect, and who is now defending it, to the death as it's increasingly obvious. It's the over-regulation of the EU is a serious problem. Part of her defense of digital regulation not being the cause of lack of innovation and productivity in the EU is to demonstrate, I think, quite effectively that the EU's problems are much more severe than just regulation and just digital regulation. That the reason that it doesn't match the United States is not just because we have a ex post approach to regulation and enforcement, that is to say, when a violation or abuse has occurred, enforce against it afterwards, don't inhibit it at the outset. She says, no, Europe has much greater problems than just regulation. The inability to form, capital formation is much harder there. The fragmented market in the EU is really, even though the EU is all about trying to be one digital market, but it really isn't working. The labor laws that don't allow them to companies to fire people, and then the culture, the stigma against failure. If you go bankrupt in Silicon Valley, hey, you've got a notch on your belt, you go for the next one. So I think the problem is really complex and severe and almost transcendent there. So maybe the only place they can start is by lowering digital regulation, because the other problems are even harder to address, and they are probably national rather than from Brussels. On the other question of small and medium-sized companies, that's one area where they have very expressly and consciously recognize they have a problem, and they're specifically trying to streamline the application of some of the new digital regulations when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises. But of course, since so much of the technology is developed and deployed by bigger companies, that may not help the American interests much, but maybe the local interests.
Steve, you spent a lot of time in bilaterals with both Brussels and with the member states. What did you find?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely both. Neither the member states are not a monolith, and the Commission and officials in Brussels are not a monolith. So we have to work with both of them. And our team, when I was at the Cyberspace and Digital Policy, we tried to engage member states at the same time that we worked with the Commission. And I think we did make some progress on some specific issues to prevent some of the worst potential outcomes on some regulatory measures. But it is key to make sure that we are, as a government, having a coordinated approach that is comprehensive in terms of engaging member states individually, at the same time that we're working with Brussels through some type of mechanism like the TTC or other negotiations. And I did just want to note, too, Alan's highlighting the DPF, the Digital Privacy Framework, which I think is a really good example of how through a lot of work over a lot of years, a lot of different conversations, a lot of back and forth, a lot of changes and tinkering and fine-tuning, we're able to come up with a mechanism that provides interoperability and has succeeded, I think, because of some convergence in our approaches. And we need to see that same kind of work in years to come on these other irritants in our relationship, like the DSA, DMA, the AI Act, the Space Act coming up, where we can have a conversation. And I think it's important for our administration to make sure that digital trade issues are prioritized in that engagement as other issues are as well.
Terrific. I think we have time for one question from the audience.
David,
Oh,
can I say
yes,
one
please,
more,
Andrew.
one more quick thought? Because I think Alan's right, that to the extent that you see movement in Europe, it really is on sort of, you provide a thoroughfare, a fast lane for small and medium. There's some movement there. And I would say, again, going back to one of my points earlier, the problem with that is sort of this idea there's an artificial threshold. It's like an artificial threshold. If you're under the threshold, you don't have to comply with regulation. But if you're bigger than the threshold, you do. It creates, first of all, perverse incentives, even for the small and medium companies. Because, like, well, get big, but don't get bigger, because then you're just going to have this regulatory weight imposed. It's very counterproductive. And it also, I think, it's antithetical to the way that we approach these issues, which is reflected in our competition law and other things, which is competition actually produces critical benefits for consumers and for the economy. And you want your regulatory approach to support competition. Of course, you want to make sure that there are harms, that you're able to identify those harms, establish them, balance risk and reward if you're going to intervene. But the idea that you don't want competition and you're going to put these thresholds into your approach to regulation to functionally prevent competition based on business side, I think is really at the heart of the problem that Europe is struggling with.
Right. Very anti-consumer from many of our processes. Steve?
Andrew, you talked about the failed approach of ex-ante regulation of digital services. And we have our own problem with that in the United States, particularly with AI, where the states introduced over 1,000 pieces of legislation this year alone to regulate AI before it even gets out of the box. And the pushback on that has been to say that, wait, we have a lot of ways to address the harms that might occur if a lender used AI in denying you a loan or an employer dismissed you based on AI. So we said strong, robust, harms-based enforcement at the state and federal level is the pivot away from ex-ante. So the question, does Europe also have a robust system to file complaints, investigations, and address harms? And if so, could we encourage the Europeans to simply pivot to that and pretend that they're adjusting their approach as opposed to abandoning ex-ante?
I think they do, Stephen. It's really, Europe is notable because they've had such robust legal regimes overall. The enforcement and regulatory, as a general rule, are quite sophisticated, quite able to gather evidence and make fairly refined judgments where they identify potential harms. and where you have a strong court system with excellent quality of judges as a general rule, as a backstop if there's a disagreement. And I think that's, and it's clearly observable here, like those regimes work, whether it's in competition or consumer deception or privacy or any other area of law. And I think part of what happened was, well, digital really sort of took over in every aspect of the economy, and there were a number of companies that scaled quite quickly. And so there was like, well, we got to do something that's different in kind, when in fact that has not proved to be true. And I think the problem with thinking about the state example here, because I think it's really important, you know, we're spending 24/7, 365 trying to figure out AI and in the ways in which we're going to be able to use it to try to deliver more fantastic innovations to consumers. But we don't know the answers to those questions yet. And I don't, even the folks up here talking about quantum computing, et cetera, like nobody really has like the answer to how that's going to develop. And so the idea that you should sort of impose a bunch of laws now before you're even, you know, starting to get out of the box on developing that understanding and developing your sense about if there are particular harms, whether you need to do anything else in terms of the regime required to address them, I think is a terrible mistake, particularly because we do know enough now to see the power of AI. And I'm firmly convinced, and I think everyone in this room is, that it will transform the economy again in a way that is at least as powerful as the advent of computers and the internet were.
Well, I think on that note, I see that Scott has the hook out for us. So let us thank this terrific panel for a great set of presentations.
That's great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Fantastic.